And I'll say it now, you have to get them the hell out.
So Donald Trump's been wanting to deport immigrants for a while. And at rallies like this, conservatives are, well, just see for yourself.
You have to get them out. I'm sorry.
So you see the people here, they've got something in common with the people they want to deport, because a brand new study found that just like Republicans, ethnic minorities like Asian, Hispanic and black people, even the ones that lean left, might actually prefer a leader like Trump, even though this can happen to them.
The owner of Trump Burger Restaurants, which has several locations in the Houston area, has been arrested by Immigration and Customs Enforcement and now faces deportation.
Let's find out why. For the last 7 years, psychologists and political scientists have agreed on at least one thing, and it's that tough, dominant leaders, like those iron-fisted ones who rule by fear, appeal to mostly people on the right. Now, these are the leaders who really take charge. They punish anyone who breaks rules, especially the ones that are on the other side, and do what's necessary to get things done. And for decades, the thinking was conservatives like that and liberals don't. That was the general consensus until now, because a paper in the Journal of Psychological Science with data from over 34,000 people says that the general consensus is wrong, like dead wrong. See, it found that black, Asian and Hispanic people who lean left prefer dominant leaders just as much as white Republicans, sometimes even more. Now this doesn't seem to add up, but it will start to make sense very soon, because I'm going to show you how nearly 100 years worth of theorizing was wrong about leadership preferences and what this means for politics and the future of political power. But first, we have to start with why. Why are left-leaning ethnic minorities more aligned with the right when it comes to leadership preferences? The reason, it turns out, it's all about trust. Most people, including ethnic minorities, usually have a very different experience with our modern political and economic system.
There's been a steep decline in the trust that people feel in institutions in most developed countries.
When it comes to wealth, home ownership, the justice system, healthcare, education, labor, taxation, I can go on and on, ethnic minorities often get left behind, including everyone else in the working class. Now, when we talk about trust in institutions, we're not starting from the same baseline. For many minority communities, the system hasn't just failed them, it's actively working against them. I mean, at this point, it's pretty fair if you stop trusting institutions, especially when Trump shows up once again and promises to make the system even worse for minorities with his immigration policies, the big beautiful bill, and the stupid tariffs. So what happens when a presidential candidate with a history of policies and rhetoric that harms minorities runs for the presidency again?
You know, out of modern American presidents, this is considered the most racially insensitive, I'll just say that, right? This is the most a Republican has won over minorities since the Civil Rights Act or so, I was born in the Netherlands to parents of Indian origin. When I was 5, I moved to Japan. Then when I was 10, I moved to Texas. And then as an adult too, I've spent time at a lot of different institutions of higher learning, spanning across countries and continents. One thing that really struck me throughout my life, and then, of course, in the Western context, I'm an ethnic minority, and pretty much every place I've lived in, I'm an ethnic minority as well. But particularly in the West, I realized something interesting. A lot of minorities have values and preferences that are closer to the political right, especially when it comes to abstract values or leadership preferences, things like that, but still end up voting for the political left.
I mean, yeah, that's spot on. Because ethnic minorities in the West often hold these conservative-leaning values, stuff that aligns with the right, but when it comes to voting, they swing left more often than not. But before we understand why, let's just zoom out for a sec and just look at where these values even come from.
The worst idea in all of psychology is the idea that the mind is a blank slate at birth. Developmental psychology has shown that kids come into the world already knowing so much about the physical and social worlds, and programmed to make it really easy for them to learn certain things and hard to learn others.
Now that's Jonathan Haidt, a political and social scientist who wrote The Righteous Mind and introduced the world to the moral foundation theory. Now this theory breaks down why the left and the right have such different value systems.
To find out, my colleague Craig Joseph and I read through the literature on anthropology, on cultural variation and morality, and also on evolutionary psychology, looking for matches. What are the sorts of things that people talk about across disciplines, that you find across cultures and even across species? We found five best matches, which we call the five foundations of morality. The first one is harm care. We're all mammals here. We all have a lot of neural and hormonal programming that makes us really bond with others, care for others, feel compassion for others, especially the weak and vulnerable, gives us very strong feelings about those who cause harm. The second foundation is fairness, reciprocity. The evidence for people could not be clearer. Third foundation is in-group loyalty. You do find groups in the animal kingdom, you do find cooperative groups, but these groups are always either very small or they're all siblings. It's only among humans that you find very large groups of people who are able to cooperate, join together into groups, but in this case, groups that are united to fight other groups. This probably comes from our long history of tribal living, of tribal psychology. And this tribal psychology is so deeply pleasurable that even when we don't have tribes, we go ahead and make them because it's fun. The fourth foundation is authority respect. Here you see submissive gestures from two members of very closely related species. The fifth foundation is purity sanctity. It's about any kind of ideology, any kind of idea that tells you that you can attain virtue by controlling what you do with your body, by controlling what you put into your body. And while the political right may moralize sex much more, the political left is really doing a lot of it with food. Food is becoming extremely moralized nowadays, and a lot of it is ideas about purity, about what you're willing to touch or put into your body. I believe these are the five best candidates for what's written on the first draft of the moral mind. I think this is what we come with, at least a preparedness to learn all of these things.
Now to really understand the different value systems, imagine your mind is a building packed with alarm sensors. Now each one is tuned to notice different problems tied to one of the five moral foundations. Now based on what happens around you, a different alarm will go off and you'll feel some sort of way, you'll feel empathy, rage, compassion, whatever. But here is the thing, everyone's alarms are tuned slightly differently. Some are more sensitive and others are less. Now it just depends on your childhood, your religion, your culture, and all of the personal experiences you've had. Now that's why the same event can trigger different responses, because it is all about those alarms and how they're calibrated. Now here's a real life example that you can probably remember, the Colin Kaepernick story.
San Francisco 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick refusing to stand during the national anthem tonight in San Diego. He said it is a statement against police killings of black men and other acts of social injustices.
On bended knee, as a sea of military and football fans stood for the national anthem tonight, quarterback Colin Kaepernick is the talk of the 49ers-Chargers game in San Diego.
Some say not standing up during the national anthem is the ultimate disrespect.
It's extremely disrespectful.
I think it's just wrong. It's just respect.
When Kaepernick knelt during the national anthem, the people on the right heard their loyalty and authority alarms blaring. To them, kneeling meant disrespecting the flag, undermining the country, and showing disloyalty to his fellow Americans. So it kind of makes sense why they were so pissed. For the people on the left, those alarms weren't that sensitive. Instead, their care harm alarms went off. They saw a man peacefully protesting racial injustice and police brutality.
Well, I saw a guy in Florida, a white guy, stab two people, kill him. Female officer tase him. They have to wait 10, 15 minutes, and they take him alive. I see a guy selling CDs, and he's killed. I see a guy selling loose leaf cigarettes, and he's killed. See, that's what gets us up in arms.
They saw him trying to protect vulnerable communities. Kneeling wasn't about disrespect at all. It was about compassion and fairness. Same moment, totally different reactions. Now that's why one event can split us up. It's because we're not hearing the same alarms going off. Now here's where things really get fascinating. Now just look at how liberals rank these. Harm and fairness way up at the top, with authority, loyalty, and sanctity lower. Now as you slide more towards conservatism, harm and fairness dip, while the others climb up to even it out. Now the moral foundations theory has completely reshaped how we see the left and right divide.
Within any country, the disagreement isn't over harm and fairness. We debate over what's fair, but everybody agrees that harm and fairness matter. Moral arguments within cultures are especially about issues of in-group authority, purity.
Now these unique moral hierarchies dictate how we think, feel, and act on political and social issues. But there is a gap. There's one thing Haidt hasn't done. He hasn't dove in deep into how different ethnicities shake this up.
There's this common and prevailing wisdom among social scientists that, at least in Western countries, it's very much a right-wing thing, that the political right very much favors strong leaders. But then, as I'm thinking about it and looking at the literature, much of it was done on predominantly white samples and didn't really look too much at ethnicity, which made sense in the past. The West was a much less ethnically or racially diverse place. But now that they are, then, I was wondering, does this, is it really a uniquely right-wing phenomenon? Or, especially as minorities become a larger and larger share of the electorate, where do minorities fit into the picture, right?
Before Krishnan's research, most social and political scientists believed that the largest divide in the West was left versus right. And this political divide, which is based on moral values, is directly related to the political decisions people make. But Krishnan's team found that the real divide is between left-wing whites and literally everyone else. Now, I'm going to say this one more time because how crazy this is, right? White and all ethnic minorities are all clustered together in the moral value preferences, and the actual outliers are white lefties. And this changes everything, because minorities align more with the right-wing whites on values and leaders, but they mostly vote left. Now, this kind of pokes a pretty big hole in the values dictate politics idea.
My general intuition is that when it comes to the more abstract the values are, then you see this pattern where minorities are closer to the right. But when it comes to values in terms of policy positions or in terms of ideologies that are just much more specific, then you see minorities get closer to the left. We found that ethnic identification and this perception of the right being hostile to minority interests and racist and things like that, that's what drove a lot of minorities to the political left.
I'm thinking, okay, so you've got ethnic minorities who are sort of shifting towards sort of the right a bit more as Donald Trump goes through the election cycle again and again. I'm not saying these are the right-wing inherent to being right, but they're much more hostile to immigrants and ethnic minorities. And I wonder how much more powerful that side of the political sphere would be if they just were less hostile. Because if you think about, like you said, the moral foundations, the moral values align more, and if they drop the hostility, it has the potential, at least, to shift political power in the US pretty significantly based on the findings of your data.
It's a paradox of sorts, because when Donald Trump entered the political picture, large consensus among a lot of people is that, Donald Trump, says a lot of racially inflammatory things, racist things, is racially insensitive, etc. Yet from 2012 to 2016, then for 2016 to 2020, when Trump lost the election and actually ended up, getting a lower percentage of votes, and then to 2024, each of those elections, the Republican Party actually gained among minority voters. Maybe minorities are starting to become more aligned in terms of their abstract moral values and their politics. But another one that speaks more to Trump as a unique figure is this appeal of a leader that seems tough and strong and authoritarian or authoritative. That could be what's driving it, and that's what our paper suggests.
And this brings us back to trust, because trust, according to Krishnan's research, predicts strong leader preference, which can explain why minorities are shifting towards Trump. But why trust? What is it about trust, and specifically trust in strangers, that has the potential to shift political power? Well, it turns out that trusting strangers has a lot to do with being weird.
So are you familiar with the weirdest people in the world?
If you're a Westerner, educated, in an industrial spot, not poor, and in a democracy, you're part of the weirdest people on Earth. Weird people have dominated social science research. They've made up over 90% of the participants, while making up only 10% of the global population.
We pointed out that not only were experimental behavioral scientists, including psychologists and economists, sampling from a rather thin slice of human diversity, that thin slice is actually psychologically peculiar when seen in a global perspective. So to refer to these populations, we coined the backronym WEIRD as a consciousness-raising device.
So it turns out that weird people are quite different to the rest of the world in a lot of ways.
Or said another way, why are weird people so individualistic, non-conforming, overconfident, guilt-ridden, intention-obsessed, non-holistic, and willing to cooperate with strangers.
Now, one compelling reason behind this weirdness is the origin of the Catholic Church.
The Catholic Church really broke up Europe's existing kin structures, where before things like cousin marriage and things were much more common. At the height of it, maybe I think even seventh cousins or something were banned from getting married, even though like those restrictions have relaxed since then. But essentially what it did was it broke down Europe's kin networks and then created a system where you had to build trust in strangers, because otherwise, people just relied on their close relatives for trust. Like, I mean, in the South Asian context, for example, that's very much the case even to this day.
The new rules established by the medieval Catholic Church moved the West in a completely different direction compared to the rest of the world. By removing family clans and pushing couples to live away from their families and become nuclear, the Church developed a society where family ties were no longer the main organizing principle of life. What does this mean? First of all, humans have lived around strangers before this period in time. In places like ancient Greece and Mesopotamia, Egypt, and ancient China, even then, family and kin networks ruled social, political, and economic life. But after the Catholic Church systematically dissolved kin networks, a large group of humans, for the first time ever, had no other choice but to start trusting strangers. And here's why this matters. Once people start trusting strangers, they don't need a strong leader to protect the tribe. The shift from kinship to institutions is the foundation of Western democracy. And it's also the reason trust, or the lack of it, still shapes politics today. But how do we know this is true?
The church likes to write stuff down, so every time they have a meeting, we know that they discussed incest legislation and what to do about polygyny and how we can change the inheritance system and topics like this.
So part of Europe started living with a different set of rules.
Europe has a simple kinship system. Nuclear families, inheritance through both sides. Couples have to live independent of mom and dad, no arranged marriages, no marrying relatives. I'll talk more about that. And the church begins to provide social safety nets to replace that which would normally be from complex kinship.
Today, most of the West takes these social norms as a given, like they've always been here. Now, it's kind of like Gen Alpha being born into smartphones and AI. This is all they know. Now, meanwhile, the rest of us know how crazy and new this technological era is. And we also know that living with these technologies has changed our psychology in so many ways. Well, this is exactly what happened with the Western Church and Western social norms, just on a much, much larger timescale. Think thousands of years, not decades. Because the earliest records of the Catholic Church enforcing changes to social norms started in about late antiquity, which was around about 305 CE, or Common Era. So essentially, Western social norms changed over a couple thousand years compared to the rest of the world, which means that
psychology adapts to this world. This requires two quite different kinds of psychology.
Let's see how ditching tight kin networks, thanks to the Western Church, reshapes our psychology. Let's start with something called individualism. Now, individualism is about how much people focus on themselves and their personal attributes and achievements, and often don't think of themselves in the context of their close relationships.
This is a useful variable to connect with because a lot of research in psychology links it to understandings of the self, people's tendency to self-enhance, to promote themselves, to be overconfident of their own abilities is linked to individualism. The importance of self-esteem for mental health is related to individualism, and something called analytic thinking, so people can approach problems analytically or holistically. That's also linked to this.
All right, now it's time for my favorite part. Let's get into the data. First, let's start with the Eastern Church. When you map out how much individualism changes with how long people were exposed to the Eastern Church, this is what you get. As you can see, individualism stays pretty constant. Bear in mind, this is a 1,000-year timeline. Now let's look at what happens to individualism when people are exposed to the Western Church over the same time period. Right, individualism starts at the same place, but increases to almost 3 times greater when compared to the Eastern Church. And the same pattern shows up when you look at current family network intensities. The weaker your family network, the more likely you are to have an individualistic psychology. Now this is cool and all, but these are results from surveys and historical records. What would be even better is if we could look directly at people's behavior, and we can.
The Ash experiment is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research. A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
Please begin. The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example, if you
The actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer.
Now, just to give you a baseline, when people are on their own, they get the answer right about 97% of the time.
In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 1. 1.
2. 1. Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3. 3. 3.
3.
3.
The Ash experiment has been repeated many times, and the results have been supported again and again.
And yes, this has been supported repeatedly, but again, only with weird populations. So what happens when you involve the non-weird people?
And what you see is people from societies with higher kinship intensity are much more likely to go along with the 2 people who went before them. And then adoration of the church, same kind of relationship, longer under the Western church, lower amounts of conformity going along with the other guys.
See, now this pattern just keeps showing up again and again, where you see people think and behave differently depending on their exposure to the Western church and the strength of their kinship network. Or, in other words, whether they're weird or not. Now, what happens if we apply the same variable when measuring trust? Now, here's the thing about trust. It's actually kind of complicated to measure and understand because there's just a whole lot of different types of trust. Now, we're interested in trust in strangers because the West was exposed to strangers way before the rest of the world. So to measure trust in strangers, you have to look at how much people trust their close ties and then compare that to how much people trust people from the outside. In other words, you create an in-group and out-group. As a general rule, everyone trusts their in-group more than the out-group. And this is to be expected. But the stronger your kinship network and the less exposed you are to the Western church, the less trust you have in the out-group. And again, this makes complete sense. Because if you have strong family networks, you have no reason to worry about trusting strangers because you barely interact with them. But something crucial happens within societies with high trust versus low trust.
There's this idea going back in, political theory and political philosophy going back many years, right? With Thomas Hobbes, his idea was that humanity is inherently untrustworthy. Like if we're left to our own devices, we'd just be killing each other, right? That's like one extreme view. And then his idea was that because of that, you need a strong authoritarian leader or just a leadership system or a monarch to put people in check. And then, others like Rousseau, for example, had a very different view of human nature where he was just much more trusting that in their natural states, people are inherently good and, they would cooperate. So then, you don't need an authoritarian leader. If anything, that's counterproductive.
Now, America, being part of the weird population, is a high trusting society compared to non-weird societies anyway. But we learned at the beginning that America is weird in another way, because the political allies are actually white lefties. This means that ethnic minorities are much closer to the white right in terms of their values. So, these ethnic minorities come from non-weird societies, which means they have less trust in strangers, which means they prefer a strong and dominant leader, and this brings us back to Trump.
500,000 migrants right all over our country and changing them forever. They will never be the same. You have to get them the hell out. You have to get them out. I'm sorry.
Even though strong leaders can stop people from misbehaving and make society cooperate, strong leaders also end up acting in morally questionable ways. And this hurts the society they're trying to run. Now here's the question. What happens when we try to increase the level of trust we have in strangers?
Context in terms of shifting people's perceptions of trust really matters in terms of driving strong leader preference, because that is the mechanism that we're looking at.
Now in this experiment, Krishnan's team told participants to imagine that they live in this made-up place called Tanjota. Now it had a made-up flag and a description of what the country looked like. Then the researchers put people randomly into 2 groups. The first group was the control condition. Now these participants only received the information I just told you. In the second group, participants were given more information about Tanjota. They were told that, quote, Most strangers you meet in this city are compassionate towards others. Most strangers you meet in the city would never harm you, even if that meant that they could gain a profit out of doing so. Now this was the trust primer. Now the results showed that in the control group, left whiteys showed way more trust in strangers and a weaker preference for strong leaders compared to everyone else. But in the trust group, with the additional information, right whites and ethnic minorities moved closer to left whites, which is to say that right whites and ethnic minorities were more trusting of strangers and didn't want a strong leader as much as a control group. So what does all of this tell us? It's that when trust in strangers goes up, strong leader preferences go down. This is a promising start, but we have a long way to go.
The sad thing is that this is one of the biggest patterns in politics, and then whenever there's an election, it's like, oh, it happened, minority shifted to Trump, and then now no one talks about it. It's almost like it's inconvenient to talk about it. We don't want to talk about it. We're going to act like it didn't happen. But that's just not how you you should do political commentary or even as a campaign. It just blows my mind, you know.
The amount of times I've gone reading your paper, looking elsewhere and going, why are people not talking about this way more? This is freaking incredible how things are shifting despite the inherent and obvious racial bias, the hostility, and like so I've got some family members and people that I know in general who are ethnic minorities here in New Zealand, but also in the States. Based on what they're saying, I go, oh, you actually like Trump and like what he has to say, but you're Then I start. I'm still going, hang on a second. But what about the other racist, hostile stuff? They use a lot of motivated reasoning to explain it away, to block off the not so nice side. And really understand, is that shift simply because we just like strong leaders who are entertaining and lively as Trump is, and we're willing to ignore the not so nice side because of the discomfort it presents inherent to the ethnic minority who likes Trump?
You supported Donald Trump, even though you couldn't vote for him.
Sí, yo creo que... Yes. I believe there is a large community of Venezuelans who did.
Are you afraid of your son walking to school?
Sí. Yes, truly, yes.
Like so many other Venezuelans, she cheered when Donald Trump was elected because of his tough approach to policies, such as his promise to crack down on a violent Venezuelan criminal organization.
Batons grabbed Narcisco Barranco, who has lived in the U.S. for more than 30 years and has 3 sons serving in the Marine Corps. Agents beat Barranco on the ground, dislocating his shoulder before detaining him. In Van Nuys, agents raided a car wash, remembering this, sending patrons and workers scrambling before the 79-year-old owner, who is a U.S. citizen named Rafi, tried to ask them what they were doing.
Now, why would you trust a society that has consistently made life harder for you, where your material conditions only seem to get worse? Now, you've got one side that has similar values to you, but discriminates against you routinely. So you pick the other side where those value systems don't really fit. But hey, at least they like you and they're nice to you. And then you realize that your material conditions haven't improved under their leadership either. So why would you trust them again if your life isn't getting better?
And it's just wild to me that this is such a strong pattern and has been going on for some time. And it should be, a central discussion in politics, but it's just not. The advice I would say is pay attention to this phenomenon of minorities leaving the Democratic Party. Is this a consistent trend? Is this purely a Donald Trump effect? Or let's say, I don't know who the Republican nominee is next, but if it's, let's say, J.D. Vance or someone like that, or Marco Rubio, is that going to continue in that direction? Because if it continues in that direction, then we might not even have a system where minorities are clearly left anymore,
And if you don't think that's possible, then you probably thought Trump wouldn't win the first time or the second time. So the question is, do you really want to around? Because if you do, you're going to find out.